the Crypt.
Hello, boys and ghouls. Welcome to a very special interview episode of Dads from the Crypt, a Tales from the Crypt podcast. Today, I'm interviewing writer, director, producer, podcaster, and legendary nice guy, Mick Garris. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jason. Great to be here, although I don't qualify not being a dad. So I'm just going to have to struggle to fill the requirements.
There's a bit of a dad in all of us, we like to say. Or at least a mensch, a mentor, however you want to classify it.
Fair enough. Avuncular maybe, but not yet.
All right. So I want to do a couple background questions. What's the first movie you remember seeing?
The first genre movie I remember seeing is probably the first movie I remember seeing, and that was Son of Kong, which I was probably 5 or 6 years old. There were 4 of us Garris kids born within 5 years. And my mother had seen King Kong in the theater when she was 3 years old, and it terrified her. So she wanted to make sure it was not a horrible experience for her children. And both parents were there, were in the living room in front of the TV. And of course, Son of Kong is more comedy than horror.
Right.
And it's sweet and all, but I was transfixed by that. So that's the first one I really remember.
Mm-hmm. Did your mother, you said, saw King Kong in the theater? What was her reaction to that when she was a kid?
Terrified. She peed on her dad's lap. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. And then as you were growing up, what were your other horror influences at the time?
Well, the Universal films were, that Shock Theater package was on Channel 5. I'm a native Angelino. I was born in Los Angeles. So I grew up with all of the channels that were available that were not available across the country to a lot of people. But growing up with all the Universal classics, and then the junk too, but I couldn't tell apart the good from the bad when I was little. I watched The Four Skulls of Jonathan Drake and, Gog and everything from The Dustbin onward. I was just fascinated by Tales of the Outre. Yeah.
Wow. And then I read that I know that you put on a screening of Abbott and Costello.
Yeah, Frankenstein.
I'm really bummed I couldn't go to that because we were doing the Dead Easy script read, because I've always wanted to see that in the theater.
It was so great. I had never seen it in a theater, and they got a beautiful DCP. And this was at the Cinematheque at the Los Feliz Theater here in Los Angeles. And I'd never seen it on the big screen, but it's the movie I've seen more than any other film. Growing up, whenever it was on, I'd watch it. And then the place was packed, and a wide range of ages, from gray-haired people like myself to children, and everything worked. They jumped at the scary parts. They laughed at the funny parts. It felt like it was brand new, despite it being a 1947 movie. And it was the best time. Everybody had a really terrific time.
Yeah, it holds up so well. I watched it maybe a year ago on Halloween. I need to show it to my kids. I think they're ready for it. But,
how old are they?
They're 8 now.
That's probably the perfect age.
Right. Each one's a little different. Like my daughter's really into Wednesday and that kind of spooky stuff. My other son, not as much. So I'll be curious how he would react. But yeah, it just holds up. It's amazing how a really well-made, real done movie, 50, 60, however many years later.
Yeah. Well, it was 1947. So
yeah,
it's a long time. So,
and then you were on a lot of infamous film sets, and we just had the 40th anniversary of Videodrome.
Yeah.
And can you tell us any memories about being on set for that?
Yeah, I did the making of Videodrome. I was doing publicity. The first time I'd ever worked with David Cronenberg was doing publicity for Scanners. Mm. This was the first time I was actually on the set of one of his movies being made. Yeah, it was great to be on the set for Videodrome up in Toronto. And we we saw all of the Rick Baker creations, the TV set that has the hand with the flesh gun coming out of it, all of these things. And I interviewed David, and I interviewed Debbie Harry, and I interviewed Rick for the making of Videodrome. And I was there watching the set when he's doing an interview, and Debbie Harry is the other guest, James Woods and Debbie Harry. And they are being interviewed on a TV show, and there's this sexual tension between the two of them. So I was there for that and a couple other scenes, and just watching David Cronenberg, who's very intellectual, very calm, and the set was quiet and easy, and everybody seemed to be supported. And it was really fascinating to watch someone who is at the height of his powers wielding his powers in such a quiet and yet masterful way. It was very influential to watch filmmakers who you admire when you hope one day to be a filmmaker, and it's hard not to be influenced by the good ones.
Yeah. Here's a question about that scene in particular. I was wondering how they did this. So there's the TV interview, and then there's the one guy who only communicates via TV.
Right.
Did they have him like in another room feeding that live feeding, or did they pre-tape those and just press play?
Yeah, that was a pre-record on videotape, and yes, so they had to time it to the responses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Dr.
it's amazing.
Brian Oblivion, yeah.
Yes, there you go. Yeah, it's amazing how that movie is more relevant now in the internet age than even was then.
Absolutely, and it was pretty prescient even back in those times, but now obviously we get it through the internet rather than through cable TV. But the vast variety of sources to find our entertainment, and the depths to which those sources will go to reach an audience, is very much like Videodrome.
Right. Have you seen Infinity Pool yet?
See which one?
Infinity Pool, his Brandon.
Oh yeah,
movie.
Brandon's. Yeah. It is so much son of Cronenberg.
Yeah.
It really goes for it, and Brandon definitely has a lot of the chops his father does, and a lot of the interests as well. The whole body horror thing seems to be genetic in the Cronenberg family, doesn't it?
in a creepy body horror way, yes.
Yeah.
And then I read that you were also a zombie in the Thriller music video. How did that happen?
It's true. Rick Baker and I were very good friends, and he asked me and my wife Cynthia if we would want to be zombies in this music video they were making with John Landis, who was also a very good friend. I met him when he was in his production office prepping an Animal House, and I was answering phones for the original Star Wars. And so Landis and I met there. We became friends. And when Rick and every makeup artist in LA got together to do the zombies for Thriller, they asked us, and of course we said sure. And I found out just how claustrophobic I am, and getting my face cast and being made up for 3 hours in a chair made me realize that's the last time I want to do this. But it was so great and so historic, and being able to watch Michael at work, and later on I would direct him in another piece, but just being there and watching him explode as soon as John would call action, it was like he was reanimated. He's very quiet. Hi, it's nice to see you, Mick. It's really great to meet you. You look like Spielberg. And then action, bam, and it just went for it. He was really remarkable.
Where were you on the zombie? Can you pick out which zombie you are?
Yeah, I'm the last one to crawl out of the dirt.
Oh.
And then inside the house, Cynthia and I are on either side of Michael. I'm on Michael's right shoulder, camera left side.
Okay, yeah, I have to go watch that.
I'm the one you can recognize because I'm not wearing fake teeth. I'm the grumpy zombie looking like that. Now I've aged into my role, and my hair is naturally this color.
So you weren't one of the dancer zombies, is what you're saying.
No, I'm not that talented. No, they had dancer zombies. They had close-up zombies, which we were close-up zombies, where the makeup was much more detailed.
Mm.
And then there were background zombies, which were mainly masks that were not particularly articulated and the like, that could be made up and put in place more quickly. So close-up zombies, background zombies, and dancer zombies were all the compartmentalized versions of the walking and dancing dead in that.
Yeah, I went to Monsterpalooza in Burbank, one of the earlier ones, and they had people being made up as the Thriller zombies
Yeah.
all throughout the day. And at the very end of the day, they all just got up and did the whole Thriller sequence.
dance,
Yeah, it was amazing.
It's pretty great. It was great. There's some prison in the Philippines,
Yes, I saw.
Yeah, where they all did the Thriller dance, and it's remarkable. And one of those things on YouTube that just keeps popping up every now and then.
Yeah. Now I just want to go back. You said were you on the set for Animal House? Did you?
I was not. No, his
Okay.
production office was across the street from Universal Studios, where the less important productions were.
Right.
Were in a former post office or a former motel. Later, it became the post office, and so George Lucas's Star Wars offices, even though it was a Fox movie, that's where his offices for Star Wars Corporation was. And I was working as a receptionist answering phones there. And John's production office for Animal House, before he moved up to Eugene, Oregon for the production, we were next door to one another. And that's how we met and became friends.
Yeah, I went to college at the University of Oregon in Eugene. So it's one of those things, like after your freshman year, you watch the movie, you can pick out pretty much every scene. And
so were you in the Animal House?
Oh, I wasn't, but a family friend of mine actually was in the food fight scene.
Food fight.
He just had to be going there, and they just asked a bunch of students to be extras. So he got to be an extra in that scene.
Such a classic.
Such a classic. All right. And then one of your first directing gigs was for Critters too. How did that come about?
Well, I had been writing, and I had the first person to hire me as a writer was Steven Spielberg for Amazing Stories. So suddenly everybody was offering me writing jobs, not because I was good, but because Steven Spielberg hired me, so I must be okay.
Right.
These were all the people who would never read anything of mine before. But then once Steven Spielberg had me writing on Amazing Stories, I was on staff on Amazing Stories, and various studios would offer me writing gigs. And at the time, I was under contract on Amazing Stories, but it was not exclusive. Jeffrey Katzenberg at that time was running Disney, and they wanted to put me under contract to be exclusively writing for the Disney studios. And I didn't want to be exclusive with anybody because of opportunities that might pop up at other studios or independents or wherever. So he saw John Landis walking down the corridor, knew that we were friends, and came back in and said, look, I just talked to John Landis. I would like you to write and direct an episode of this new show we have called the Disney. It was a Sunday night Disney show.
Right.
And it was The World of Disney. The Disney Sunday Movie is the official title at that time. Mm-hmm. So Gary Cooper, no, not Gary Cooper, the other Cooper, Jackie Cooper directed the first episode. And then they asked me to write and direct the second one. He said, I just talked to John Landis, and he said that he would produce it for you to write and direct it. And so I found out later that Landis said, I just lied to him. You know, I told him, you're a great director. He'd be terrific. And then he said to me, don't you fuck it up, because I don't want to step in for you. And so this was Fuzzbucket, which was my first. It was a story I had proposed to Amazing Stories that Spielberg had passed on, and about an imaginary friend. And so I took it to Disney as a potential Disney Sunday movie, a 1-hour movie. And they loved it and said, okay, we are going to hire you to direct this. And it was my first directing gig. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but I thought I did. And I ended up getting a wonderful cast and made it. And it was a very big rating success. And then it kept playing on the Disney Channel for decades, and now it's actually on Disney Plus,
Oh,
the infamous Fuzz Bucket. It has not aged well if it was good in the first place. Um, it was a good place to learn how to make movies. So,
right. Because you didn't go to film school, right?
no, I could never have afforded that.
Mhm.
Very, very working class upbringing.
Right, but that gives you a whole different perspective on storytelling and the mechanics of
Yeah,
you
yeah,
weren't formalized.
yeah. I didn't know the rules. I didn't know the rules, and you know, the good thing about film school is that you get to work with equipment. You learn what the lines of demarcation are in terms of employment, who does what job, and how they overlap or how they don't. And not having been in that position when I was directing for the first time, my first assistant director was really ill and basically didn't do anything.
Mm.
And I ended up, I didn't know what I was supposed to do. So I did most of what he was supposed to do. And so it was a very heavy load. And I just thought that's what directors did.
Yeah, I just read a really good book by Dave McGiffert, who was the first AD for like Robert Zemeckis and on the
Yeah.
76 King Kong. And I didn't really understand what assistant directors did, or
They
it's a
work
really,
harder than anybody on
yeah,
the set. Yeah.
it's a really, really good book. I highly recommend that. I think it's called Best Seat in the House. Just came
Great.
out.
Excellent. I'll look it up. Thanks.
And then so Critters.
Yes. Oh, Critters too. So I had been working for Steven Spielberg, and people found me hireable at that time. The first Critters had come out. It was a very modest success, but it was a very low budget film, and it was an independent release. So there wasn't a lot of money spent on the marketing. And it had very Spielbergian qualities. So New Line Cinema and Robert Shea came to me because I was working for Spielberg. They hoped some of the magic of rubbing up against Spielberg would rub off on a Critters sequel. I was a writer as well as a director. Now I had proven myself by directing for Disney, and I had directed an episode of Amazing Stories, which quality-wise was 180 degrees from Fuzz Bucket, something I'm still proud for people to see to this day. And so New Line offered me a greenlit movie, which almost never happens. I was writing The Fly 2 during a regime change when one head of the studio was booted for another head of the studio. They decided that they wanted Fly 2 to be a teenage monster movie rather than represent the sophisticated, deeper story that David Cronenberg had told in the first one. So I was being driven by two different factions pulling Fly 2 in two different ways, and I was only attached as a screenwriter. I got offered by New Line a Go film, a sequel to a low-budget ripoff of Gremlins, and I really liked the script that David Toohey had written, and they told me that I could revise it any way that I liked. I told them my ideas, and you rarely get offered a greenlit movie with no development involved other than what you will be doing yourself. And so they wanted some of that Spielberg stardust on their movie. And so I think that's pretty much why I was there. They get 2-for-1 offer with a writer director, somebody who knows how the Spielberg machine works, at least from an external sense, and the opportunity to do something that turned out to be my only full out comedy, and still have horror that takes itself seriously and has some really sweet characters that go a lot deeper than the average Little Gremlins ripoff movies did.
Yeah, I watched 1 and 2 back to back the other night to prepare. And they're really fun. They're really underrated. They're really fun.
Yeah.
And then you have the Cheeto brothers doing their effects, which are always
Yeah, they're
amazing.
great. Yeah, and they had just come off making the Killer Clowns from Outer Space.
Mm.
So they wrote, produced, and directed that, as well as did the creatures, and they just handled all the creature stuff for Critters too, and they were great and are still friends. Yeah.
Oh, great. So I have a question. How do you achieve the massive critter ball, the one the size of like a Buick?
Well, there are two of them, And it
Mhm.
depends on which one you're talking about. One of them was fully articulated and manual and had remote controlled chewing critter
Okay.
head.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah, I noticed one actually like had like chewing
Yeah,
jaws on them.
they did that, but that weighed like half a ton at least, probably a ton.
Mhm.
And so when it was next to the truck, it was on an axle connected to the truck that would slide closer and nearer. And then they'd use remote control to do the snapping mouths. But there was another one which chased people, and it was basically a big balloon covered with critter pelts. It didn't have any faces on it. And when you first see it, the first shot of it coming into town, if you look closely, at the bottom, you see two pair of legs of a couple of the crew pushing it and rolling it along. But that's the one that rolls over the guy and
Okay.
leaves his denuded corpse in its wake. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's such a sequel thing. Like, well, we got first one had one critter, now we have 100 critters
Yeah.
rolling over people.
The critter ball. How do we top it? And
Yeah.
yeah.
And also bizarrely, this is an Easter themed horror movie.
Not many of those. And for that reason, it still gets revived. You know, people every Easter I get called to see if I would come and host a screening in Vancouver or Chicago or whatever. And it shows in film festivals to this day. It's very weird for a movie with a 2 in the title to be revived 35 years after the fact.
Sure.
This is its 35th anniversary.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
Was that now the Easter theme? Was that your contribution? Was that there when you got it?
It was already there. Yeah.
Mhm.
But we really rolled with it with all the
yes.
little, yes, so to speak, but all the little old ladies. And one of my favorite themes, and it shows up a lot in the movies I've been able to do, is Norman Rockwell Goes to Hell.
Mm.
You take the ideal America, the middle America that probably never really existed in the first place, this peaceful, beautiful, bucolic, Midwestern, small town America, and then you just send it to hell the way that David Lynch did in Blue Velvet. You see the beautiful lawn and the slow motion sprinklers watering the lawn, and then you look closer and there's a detached ear in the grass. So that's sending Norman Rockwell to hell.
That was your the guy in the Easter bunny getting mutilated from the inside.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a kill I don't think I've ever seen before. I don't think I've ever done anything like that.
Thank you. That's one I added, and it just is so seemingly a Warner Brothers Roadrunner cartoon until they actually rip him to death. And
because you're like, you're not sure you're supposed to be laughing or horrified, but you're kind of doing both at the same time. It's great. That's great.
Yeah, I like to confuse your emotions when you're watching.
And then you also wrote Hocus Pocus.
I did. Yeah,
which again is another classic for I think my generation.
Well,
that was a very
amazing.
gateway horror movie.
It's definitely entry-level horror. And it's amazing to have worked on something. Now, there were 11 other writers on it after me, and I wrote my drafts 8 years before they shot the script.
Oh, wow.
But they end up going back to the original screenplays that I had written to the point where, I get the first credit on the screenplay and share the story credit with the brilliant David Kirshner, whose idea it was. But it was a mild success at best when it came out. It's way more successful now than it ever has been.
Yeah, that's a strange phenomenon because now sequels movies are getting sequels 30 years after the fact.
Yeah, Hocus Pocus 2 came out and it was, it was 29 years after the fact. And it's been the most watched streaming movie in history. And, it came out of our movie that now, to be connected with something that's iconic and attached to a holiday every year. You watch kids trick-or-treating dressed as Billy Butcherson or the Sanderson sisters. It's like, how in the world did this happen with something I had something to do with?
Well, you just got NECA figures based on those characters. That's when you've made it. When NECA
NECA and the Funko Pops are out there too, big time. Yeah.
And I always like to ask creators or writers, like, do you have an actor or actress in mind when you're thinking of a character, or did you like associate, like, is this going to be Sarah Michelle, not Sarah Michelle Gellar, Sarah Jessica Parker, or what's the
Yeah,
other?
Bette Midler.
Bette
Or
Midler, yeah.
Jimmy, yeah.
Did you have like actresses, like big, because they're such big characters? Did you have like big actresses in mind as you're
No,
writing?
when I'm writing the character, because the chances of getting an actor that you're looking for are so small.
Right.
First, because of timing, and then there's the business end, and then will they like it enough to want to commit to it? So when I'm writing, I write the character because I know there's so many great actors out there, and you write the character as well and as deeply as you can to make actors want to play those characters. So I had completely given up all hope on Hocus Pocus getting made because it was 8 years after I finished with it before anything happened. But what happened was they said, Bette Midler is interested in playing one of the Sanderson sisters. And it was like, really? If you get she was at the peak of
Right.
her film career. And if you get a movie star saying, I want to do this and I'm going to commit to this, there's your green light. And that's what happened. Once she became connected to it, suddenly we're off and running. The wheels start turning, and Fitzcarraldo's boat starts going downhill rather than up. Yeah.
Right. All right, and then let's move on to your Tales from the Crypt episode.
Yeah, Whirlpool.
Whirlpool. How did you get? Did Gil come recruit you for that, or how did that happen?
Yeah, well, Gil and I had been friends for years, and I had done the second episode that was shot of Freddy's Nightmares. So I knew Gil, and Alan not so much from Freddy's, but I'd met him then. And so Gil and I were friends, and I had done The Stand. And he, after that, I was enough of a name because The Stand was such a huge success that he could invite me to do one of the Tales from the Crypt. And mine was much more comedic. They all have a comedic bent to them, but some of them, William Friedkin is really serious in his work, and some of the others. But, mine was a really playful script, and Al and Gil had written something really playful. And a couple of the things that I asked if we could do, a couple changes I wanted to make, was to, first of all, set it in the 1950s rather than being contemporary. And they were really happy to do that and set it in the EC offices. And also to reverse the roles so that the publisher was the woman and the nebbish cartoonist was the man. And that's not what it was like originally. And then I wanted to cast comedians in those roles, just because comedians often make really good actors. And both of Richard Lewis and Rita Rudner were very successful stand-up comics at the peak of their careers. And it turns out that Richard Lewis was a real horror fan as well. Rita Rudner, not so much, but the roles were really fun for them. And, the commitment was 5-6 days, something short, and 5 days, I think. And so we ended up doing something, and it was not like most episodes. It was a little different and playful, and it was really well received. And I had a great time doing something that was comedic, because most of my work, there's not room for too much comedy in it. After Critters 2 and Tales from the Crypt, it gets a little darker.
Right, and it's not very obvious comedy because there's like someone's getting murdered over. Like
Yes.
the concept is humorous, but what's happening on screen isn't humorous on paper.
Right.
But the way they play it, and yeah, exactly.
Well, it's really what I call red comedy, where it's comedy so bloody that it's so outrageous that it makes you laugh.
Right, because this was like I don't know if it was made a year, but at least it came out a year after Groundhog Day.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm sure there was influence there, but you'd have to ask Al and Gil about that.
Mhm. So speaking of Al, whose idea was it to cast him as Iggy?
Me, I wanted him to be in there. Yeah. And uh, so my wife and I are also in the background in one of the
Oh,
scenes
okay.
as well. Cynthia's in there. Um, but yeah, it's fun to put in little treats for the audience like that.
Yeah, well, it's again, I've only known Al for like a little over a year now, so I've seen him like baby face, young.
Yeah.
Is it's a
Yeah,
real
it's
trip
very
for me.
different with his beard and everything. Yes.
And he trained for acting, I think in college. He was a drama
Yeah.
major and did all that. So it's cool to see him performing.
Oh yeah, he had a great time doing that. There's a little bit of ham in many of us. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, and that's what Tales of the Crypt is best, is at its best. And people are hamming it up and going big. And
Yeah, they had the best pilot. All three of the
oh
original
yeah.
episodes that made up the 90-minute pilot, every one of them was fantastic.
Oh yeah.
Just beautifully done. It kind of became the boobs and blood show after a while, but still, it was pretty momentous and monumental.
And ironically, compared to today's standards, it's not that bloody or booby compared to,
Bloody or booby.
yeah,
Yeah.
compared to like a Game of Thrones episode that like knocks out of the
No.
park.
Well, even, 15, 17 years ago when we were doing my show, Masters of Horror,
Mhm.
that was much more intense than Tales from the
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So,
You got banned, and we'll talk about that at some point. But
yeah.
okay, and then I want to talk about The Shining, because how could I not? I remember watching that series. I think I was like a junior in high school, all three nights, terrified.
Oh, good. Thank you.
And I the weirdest thing happened to me. I was at Midsummer Scream,
Aha.
and I happened to be sitting. I just got a random seat for your panel with Mike Flanagan,
And
and
Stephen Weber and
with Steve Weber and Henry Thomas,
yep. Yeah.
and you pointed out your wife at one point because she
Yes.
was sitting, and she happened to be sitting right in front of me.
Ah,
And you
okay.
mentioned that she was the lady in the bathtub,
She was the woman in room 217. Yeah.
and that gave me nightmares. So afterwards, I got to tap her on, I got to say hello and say, "You scared the crap out of me." And she said,
I'm
and
sure
she
she
was,
loved
oh, she was like, "Oh, thank you."
that.
So
Yeah.
they say never meet your heroes, but sometimes you do. And it's great.
Yes. Well, I like to say, despite what she looked like in that show, she's got a great personality. So,
Was it was it shocking to see your wife made up like that? Were you, I mean, I guess you put her in a couple of things, but like, did
well, she
you?
had already done Thriller, so she had
Yeah.
been the zombie route. So it wasn't frightening, it was more fascinating.
Hmm.
And she loved it. And Billy Corso, who did the makeups and won an Emmy for the makeups on that, has also won multiple Oscars in the years since. So he really tried some new techniques and did some amazing things with saran wrap and different kinds of paints and applications that really were groundbreaking and made things a lot easier for the actors.
Yeah, it leaves a huge impression because it's one of those things like for years you just close your eyes and that's what you see. Like,
Yeah,
it's like
good.
looking, her eyes are wide open, she's looking right at the kid. It's just oof.
And the cloudy eyes too.
Yeah, the cloudy eyes, that always gets me. And then you see the feet, they're all
Yeah.
shriveled up. Oof.
Great makeups.
Yeah.
Billy Corso is a genius and so deserving of the many awards he's won.
Hmm. So just to step back for a minute, you've done many Stephen King adaptations. Which do you think was more intimidating, adapting a Stephen King story or remaking a Stanley Kubrick? Not that it was a remake, but it's something that he'd
well,
already touched.
we knew that King was not a fan of the Kubrick film because the Kubrick film is not really an adaptation of the novel so much as a total reinterpretation into a Stanley Kubrick story. It's a great Stanley Kubrick movie, but it is not a faithful adaptation of a King novel.
Right.
And I realize movies and books are different animals and they don't need to be the same and probably shouldn't be the same. But if you adapt a Stephen King book, Kubrick did it his way and it was hugely successful and it's a great Kubrick film. But King really was unhappy with the removal of the book's heart. And I say this all the time, but as a filmmaker, Kubrick is cool and King as an author is warm. It's very emotional and very much of the heart and soul and not just of the mind. So it was intimidating, but we put that aside because we were saying we're not remaking the Kubrick film. We are making the King novel, bringing that to life. More intimidating to me was doing The Stand. I'd never done anything of any great scope before. Even Sleepwalkers, it was a studio feature, but it was small scale, handful of characters, very few locations.
Well, in scale of size, it's like 6 hours long.
Well, it was an 8-hour miniseries.
Or 8 hours, yeah. It's
commercials and news breaks and all that, but 6 hours total. So it was 4 movies, and we shot it in 6 states. It had 125 speaking roles. There's a scene with 600 extras. I'd never shot anything of that scope. Not many people had. And the fact that we were able to not only pull it off, but it became the highest rated miniseries in history. The intimidation factor was huge. Every day I went to work, I was doing something I'd never done before. And we were on the run. We were doing 2 locations a day. We were going to places I'd only seen some of the locations in location photos because I couldn't travel to all of them in the pre-production time. So
what was the budget on that?
That was $28 million. Yeah, which for 8 hours of network primetime television miniseries with that cast and King, that's not a whole lot of money, but it may seem like it. But to the point where we ended up having to shoot it on 16 millimeter because it was only going to be on television. And then we would just edit on standard definition video.
Going back to The Shining, what you said about the heart really makes a lot of sense, because in Kubrick's Shining, there's no point that I ever think Jack Torrance loves his family. Like,
there are no tears shed in that movie.
There's no need for that, for the Overlook to convince him to murder his family in that movie. He looks like he's ready to do it at the drop of a hat. Where Jack Weber brings so much warmth and love and pathos to that role.
Yeah, Steven Weber is an amazing actor, and I didn't really know his work very well before. I'd never seen Wings, but I knew that he was mostly known for his comedy. And when he came in and read opposite Rebecca De Mornay, it just blew us all away. The casting director and King and myself and Rebecca De Mornay were all in the casting office when he came in to read. And it just knocked us out because King was ready to pull the plug because we couldn't find anybody to agree to play Jack Torrance. Nobody wanted to step into Jack Nicholson's shoes.
Right.
And it took a really bold and really talented actor to step into that role. And this was 3 days before we started production. And King said, if we don't cast him today, we're pulling the plug. And then in walked Steven Weber and life got better.
Yeah, I imagine many people say that about any room Steven Weber walks into. Now, I read that Gary Sinise was offered the role. Is that true?
He wasn't offered the role, but he had been the lead in The Stand. And when the agreement came about that we were going to make The Shining and King had written the script and I had been hired, I called up Gary Sinise and said, I'm going to be directing a miniseries of The Stand. We had such a good time together on The Stand. You would make a great Jack Torrance. And he was the very first actor to say, well, you know, I'm not so sure I'd be comfortable stepping into Mr. Nicholson's shoes, to quote him verbatim. So then I suddenly realized, oh, we might have a problem. So he wasn't offered the role, but I asked him about the potential of him considering it.
Are there other actors that you offer the role to that you can point out?
Nobody that I can name, but there were lots of well, as far as offering, there were only a couple actors that we offered it to. One was a British actor who has since gone on to be a very popular movie star, who said yes. And then when the time came closer, we could never reach him through his agent or anyone. He just never answered again after having said yes, but he didn't sign on officially. So we had a big hole in our casting list until Weber came in.
Wow. That's an interesting, what if?
Yeah.
And then a great story you told at Screamfest was about stories of spooky events that may or may not have happened to the crew, because you guys were staying at the Overlook.
We were staying
at the Stanley.
At the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, which is where King devised the novel. The whole idea came to him one night when they were there, the last night before they were closing for the season. And he was in the bar and looking in the mirror in the bar, and the whole book, everything, beginning, middle, and end, came to him there. So a lot of people say that it's a haunted hotel. There is a guest book where people have actually, the people who worked there took notes of an apparition appearing on the second floor in front of one room or inside. People saw an old woman here and there. My personal experience, nothing really happened to me except on the first night of scouting. I spent the night in room 217 by choice.
Brave man.
And went to bed early. We were exhausted, and the air is very thin in the Rockies. And I fell asleep at like 10 o'clock or something. But at exactly midnight, I woke up wide awake, just sat up. That's it. That's the story. There's nothing more than that. The only other thing that happened that I was witness to, and other crew members talked about feeling somebody sit down on the edge of the bed and they looked and there's nobody there, things like that. I remain a skeptic because nothing like that happened to me. But while we were shooting in the lobby, we're getting ready to roll and we're ready to do a take. And suddenly there's a lot of banging from right overhead, right over us. You could hear where it was from. It was from the room directly over us. Well, everybody staying in the hotel was working on the movie. So everyone was at work and they weren't in their rooms. And we sent a PA up to the room above where it was happening. And it was the assistant director's room. And of course, he wasn't there. He was down with us. And it was completely quiet. He'd come back down. I go, all right, rolling. And then bang, 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 it would start up again. That happened about 4 or 5 times, and we could never figure out who was doing it. So that was the closest thing to a ghost happening that I was witness to.
Did someone forget to release the boiler pressure?
Yes, exactly. Jack.
And then again, it's very cool that you actually got to shoot there. It just adds so much more to it. How much of the interiors were shot at the Stanley versus a soundstage?
It was split. In a lot of the rooms, in the lobby and in the kitchen, that was all the hotel. Some of the corridors were the hotel. But we also built corridors. We built the apartment that the Torrance family lived in at the hotel. Those were sets. And of course, corridors where we're smashing holes in the walls.
Right.
That was a set. And room 217 was a set that we built in the original Denver airport, which had closed down recently because they'd opened the new airport there. So we had terminals that we could actually use for our sound stages.
Great. All right. And I want to ask about your legendary Masters of Horror dinners. How did those come about?
Well, filmmakers run into each other a lot, whether it's at film festivals or Directors Guild meetings or conventions or film festivals, whatever. And all the time, especially if you're in the genre, you're in kind of the gutter. You're not part of the mainstream group. You're not welcomed into a lot of the hoity-toity affairs that the big time Hollywood name brand directors are. And it was just kind of an underdog thing. we'd run into each other and say, you know, one of these days we ought to just have a dinner where we all get together. And it came up over and over again. And I realized nobody's going to do this if I don't. And so I spent about a week contacting, really, it was the first one was a dozen directors.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a week to finally work out a time where all of us were available. We could be there that night. It was me and Joe Dante and Wes Craven and Toby Hooper and John Carpenter and John Landis and Guillermo del Toro, Bill Malone, Stuart Gordon. I mean, it was really a great little group. And we had such a good time that the next one I set up, it took me an hour to organize. But we did it every couple of months for a few years. And more people would join in. People would say, hey, can I come to the dinners? Or I want to bring a friend who made this movie and blah, 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 until the last one we had, which was celebrating Toby Hooper after he passed away. We had 35 genre directors all together.
Wow.
And at a certain point, it's like you don't get to spend any time with the people you want to spend time with because there's so many people there. But that was, we haven't done it since before the pandemic, and it's probably time to do another one, but I don't know.
Hey, if you need someone to make some phone calls, I volunteer.
Yeah, my little black book is pretty full. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could be a fly on the wall, that would be the place.
And some people are, because it's in a public place. Although, you know, we've been, the last several were at the Smokehouse, which is across from Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank. And there are so many of us that it's a private room. So there are no flies on the wall. But we used to do it just at Hamburger Hamlet in Beverly Hills and a restaurant in Sherman Oaks. And we'd just have a big table in the middle of the restaurant. In fact, the first one we did was at a restaurant in the Valley, and we were at a table together, 12 people, and next to us there was a small group of people celebrating a birthday. And so they were singing happy birthday, and we all joined in. And afterwards, Guillermo del Toro stood up and said, "The Masters of Horror wish you a very happy birthday." So they had no idea who we were.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah. Smokehouse is great. I love that place.
Yeah, that's become the land of celebration for us. Yeah.
Yeah. The last time I was there, going back to it, my Oregon Ducks lost a really bad game. So I'm a little bit there. I haven't been back since.
Oh dear. Well, now it's got a bad taste in your mouth.
The prime rib was great, but
there you go.
The game wasn't good. All right. And then as my podcast, Dads from the Crypt, are winding down, Tales from the Crypt are in the 6th season, because we're about to cover your episode. We definitely want to cover Masters of Horror because we love anthology horror. And so I want to talk to you more about that at a later point, but can you just talk about how did the dinners transition from the dinners to, hey, let's do a show together? What was is there connection?
It kind of did. You know, it was, we don't talk all business at those dinners. You know, it's really just a group of people who have things in common, getting together and blowing off steam and talking and visiting and just hanging out together and having dinner. But one of the points of conversation would be frustrations in either making films, getting green lights, making films our way, the intrusion of the studios, the networks, all of that. And so I basically came up with the idea of doing an hour-long anthology series where each of the true masters of horror, people with name value in the brand, which weren't many, could make little movies their way. Not a lot of time, not a lot of money, but no interference. So anyone who signed on would have to agree to that. Well, we found 3 companies. We pitched to 3 companies and all of them wanted it. But the first one we pitched to was Anchor Bay, and they weren't a network. They were a DVD company. They were a home video company, and they were willing to fund it to go direct to DVD. But it would, of course, help if there had been a network involved. So when we pitched it to them in the room, they said to us, how much and when can you start? So we were off and running from the very beginning. And that's anthology horror has never been something the networks have been interested in. They always call the successful ones a fluke.
Hmm.
So in this case, there were no horror anthologies running at the time, but Showtime got it for 10% of what the show cost to make. So the episodes were $2 million a piece. Showtime paid $200,000, but it also meant they had no creative input because they were paying so little to license it. But the licensing on Showtime was really an advertisement to buy the DVDs.
Right. That was
So
the big market at the time,
yeah,
especially for
exactly.
horror, because everyone had it Showtime. So
Yeah. So, being on Showtime really was great for us because we turned into their number 2 rated series after Dexter with no advertising or publicity or marketing whatsoever. And it just really was a surprising big success for them. So yeah, it came out of Mickey and Judy saying, hey, let's put on a show, and giving the keys to the asylum to the inmates. So and it worked out great. And just Showtime ended up, another company bought Anchor Bay, or Anchor Bay sold the rights to Lionsgate, and Lionsgate sold it to NBC to do it as Fear Itself, which meant there were advertisers, there were commercials, there was broadcast standards, and it was a completely different show that I didn't want anything to do with. And I was talked into staying on for a while, and then I quit because of the writer's strike. And when I saw what they were doing with the show, I just found it untenable. So.
All right. Like I said, hopefully we can get you back and talk about those when we dive into that series.
Sounds good.
And then most currently you've been doing your own podcast, and
I have.
I'm a big fan of that. I love
Thank
both
you.
the AMAs and the interviews. They're just complement each other really well.
Thank you. I appreciate
I
that.
really enjoyed your interview with Akilah Cooper, the writer of
Oh, yeah.
Megan and Malignance.
She was great, wasn't she?
Yeah, that was a really fun interview. Such a really talented person who's really, whose star is shining as it should.
Absolutely. And it's so, we're actually in our 7th year now. I can't believe it.
Wow.
But we've done over 160 interviews, and then every other week the AMAs, the Ask Mick Anything shows, which are fun, and I don't need to research those.
Yeah. Well, because I can listen because I listen to podcasts at like 1.5 speed.
Oh, really?
So I mean, depends on who it is. Especially I find the British podcast, I have to slow them down because they talk fast. And
Yeah.
excellent. So, but like yours, I just drove to the grocery store and I listened to your whole AMA episode.
Well, the AMAs are fun size. They can be as little as a half an hour.
But yeah, it's a great, looking at the future and looking at the past at the same time with the variety of interviews you do. I really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. It's really fun. And I say this all the time too, but I genuinely learn something from every single episode.
Oh yeah. So what's next for Mick Garris? What's coming on the horizon?
Well, Clive Barker and I have been working on a pilot that we've written together that was going to one network, and that's not working out. There's the shape of cable networks is very shaky at the moment right now.
Oh yeah.
But we're talking to another company about it. There's something that I've adapted from a Stephen King story into a pilot that is looking very promising, and we just had a major television star attach himself to it. So that's going to be an hourly series if it happens, and we'll see. Just finished writing a new short story. I still keep writing fiction. I've written a couple of novels and a couple of collections and others for magazines and the like. And we've got season 7 to keep doing the podcast.
Well, you keep making it and we'll keep listening.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to wind down with a couple fun questions. We took a vote and you have the best head of hair in horror filmmaking.
Not you?
I was say, as someone who's been balding since college, what's your secret?
Genetics, I guess.
Yeah.
Just been lucky, and it's funny because my hair was really long when it was dark brown back in my rock and roll days when I was a
Mhm.
singer in a band. But for the last, I don't know, close to 10 years now, it's just been, fuck it, I may as well grow it back.
Well, because you have that cameo in The Shining where you stand up in the AA meeting, and I think you're also
Yeah.
a tranquilizer, or
I'm, let's see, my name is, I forget what my line was, but yeah, it's with a weakness for tranquilizers or
for
something.
tranquilizer. I'm like, oh, I recognize you by the hair before I
Yeah.
did the voice or the face.
And it's half the length then, and it was brown. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And then in the very first episode of Tales from the Crypt, William Sadler walks into a diner and asks for a cheese sandwich. Doesn't specify what kind of cheese, just the cheese sandwich.
Right.
If you were to walk into a diner, order a cheese sandwich, what kind of cheese would you want?
Vegan cheese.
Vegan. Oh, you're vegan.
I've been vegan for a decade or more.
Nice.
Yeah. So that's an easy one.
Yeah. Is there, well, okay, is there variety of vegan cheeses? Can you get like a cheddar
There
vegan?
is. Yes, there. And I must tell you, none of them are great. So I would probably choose a Beyond Burger instead of a cheese
Yeah.
sandwich.
I'm pretty sure like one of my first weeks, again, growing up in Eugene, Oregon, is or not growing up, but attending college in Eugene, Oregon is a very kind of hippie town. And I
Yeah.
went to my first events and they had vegan cheese. I didn't know what it was at the time.
Diet
got
cheese, and it's made from cashews, and it's kind
that-
of
it made me sick. I was
Yeah.
up chucking all night.
Yeah, well, sorry about that.
That's fine. All right. And then our last question, again, as Dads from the Crypt, we like to give out dad advice or mentor advice. What kind of advice would you like to give our audience?
To be true to yourself. If you're a creator, people are going to give you notes to try and make something more like what has been successful in the past. But the biggest successes are the things that blaze new trails and do it for the first time. And if you really believe in something you're creating, and I know this is a very narrow kind of advice, but as a creator, if you believe in it, keep kicking it. It may never come to fruition, but who cares? You've created something and it'll always be on the shelf. I've written many scripts that have never been produced, but I've never regretted spending the time to make any of them because I've gotten better every time I've gone out.
No, I mean, I think that can be applied to just about anything in life, whether, it's a job that you want, or, you want to lose weight, or, whatever your goal in life. I mean,
Don't let people talk you out of it.
Right. I came with a harebrained idea to start a Tales from the Crypt podcast 30 years after it came out that no one can actually watch legally. And here I am talking to Mick Garris almost 2 years later. So
Ta-da!
here we are. All right. Well, Mick, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you?
Well, I'm on social media. You can find me on Facebook under my name and under Postmortem with Mick Garris, and I'm Mick Garris PM on Twitter and on Instagram.
All right. Well, that wraps things up. I appreciate everyone for listening. And with that, I thank you for listening to Dads from the Crypt.
Thanks a lot, Jason.
Follow Dads from the Crypt on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or I will follow you to the grave. No, seriously, you really should watch. But be careful what you ask for. You may get it.